Love Lesson 3. Who is my neighbor? Part 1. In Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 27, it tells us a story about the Good Samaritan. And it begins this way. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, What's written in the law? What's your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. It speaks about love. Loving your neighbor as yourself. Verse 28 goes on and says, And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Now that's what we're going to talk about in this love lesson. You know, it's easier to show the love of God to those you meet once in a while than those who live with you in the same house. Sometimes we pick and choose who we want to love and whom we want to show love to, whom we want to show compassion and the love of God to flow through them, you know, from us to them and back and forth. So Jesus spoke this parable to answer the question, who is my neighbor? He's not just telling us about the story of compassion, although it does cover compassion and the kindness of the Samaritan, but he's speaking here in answer to that particular question, who is my neighbor? So here we have the parable of the Good Samaritan. A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a certain priest came along that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. In those days, the roads were really narrow. They were one-lane roads. So it would have been difficult to pass on the other side as if you hadn't seen the poor, badly beaten man lying there. We'd normally assume that the priest was probably on his way to worship God, but this attitude tells us that instead the priest was probably on his way to do some religious assignment or activity. So this tells us about the religiosity of the priesthood in those days. Now, this priest is on the same side of the road as the poor man. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever for him to cross to the other side. So let's take a look at the times. The Romans were in control, and if you weren't a Roman citizen, you were nothing. That means if a Roman had come by, seen that man lying on the side of the road, and found that he wasn't a Roman, the man would be left there to die on that roadside without any help. On the other hand, if he was found to be a Roman citizen, they would have medevaced him to the nearest hospital for treatment and probably paid for it themselves. It was the political climate of that day. So, you see, these priests were led to be politically correct. They had to be in order to get along with the Romans. They wanted to be like them if they wanted favor from the government. Now remember, the church ruled over the people, the Jews and the Gentiles of that day. And the priesthood was looked to for controlling their people. So in keeping with the political climate, that priest wouldn't have wanted to see the man and try to help him. He justified himself by not seeing the man, by being on the other side of the road. So it is that we find the priest walking along the road to fulfill his religious activities in Jerusalem. And he avoided the man altogether. Now equivocate that to today, and we have a pastor ignoring the plight of God's people in merely performing religious activities. Okay, here comes the second person. Jesus said in verse 32, Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at that place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. Now this was slightly better. The first man saw, and the tense in which this was written makes us realize that the seeing was like from a distance. The Levite, however, came near to the man. He came and looked, and then quickly moved to the other side of the road and continued on in his journey. All he did was look. Then came a third man. Jesus called him a Samaritan. Now, a Samaritan would have been a man that was shut out of the normal Jewish society. Samaritans and Jews normally have absolutely no dealings with each other. So, look at this real close. A Jewish man was injured, and two Jewish men came by and walked on the other side to keep from helping him. Then an Arab comes by and he stops and takes a look at this Jewish man. Now understand this, they are enemies. So he might have looked and said, "This is very good, you deserve it." You see, this is what the Samaritans are to the Jews, and they are that same way today. There'd be a lot of hindrances that would arise for this Samaritan in the natural, if he was going to help this man. Number one, there was no relationship between them whatsoever. Their ethnicities, number two, were in enmity. And there was a cultural barrier there. There was a relationship barrier. Number three, the Samaritan was on a business trip. This was completely out of his way, so it was a social barrier. It was not part of his planned program. Now the Samaritan looks at this man in verse 33. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was. And when he saw the man, he had compassion. So he went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animals, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Okay, so here comes the Samaritan on a donkey. He gets down from the animal, helped the man, treated and bandaged his wounds, and after all, he sacrifices his comfort and loads the man onto his donkey. So he carries him, bleeding in a mess, puts him on this donkey, and now the Samaritan, his natural enemy, has to walk. He has to go out of the way to inconvenience himself. Okay, the first place he comes to is a small inn, a motel. He said to the innkeeper in verse 35, "And he said, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I come again, I will repay you." So in other words, he paid money for this man to stay at the motel. He said, charge it to all my accounts, and when you see me again, I'll settle all the bills. So he really went all out, didn't he? He inconvenienced himself and took responsibility for all the expenses of this man. His meals, his medical care, his place of rest. And after the whole parable, Jesus said in verse 36, "So which of these three do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves?" And he said, "He who showed mercy on him." Then Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So the purpose of this parable was to show us who our neighbor is. We're going to continue on in that journey in part 2. So stay with us.